All right, so we're going to talk about aldosterone. And aldosterone, don't forget, is a steroid hormone. It's a mineralocorticoid. So it's a steroid hormone. It's produced in the adrenal cortex. And secreted by the adrenal cortex. So as a review, we talked about the renin-angiotensin mechanism when we talked about glomerular filtration rate. And that had to do with something that we call the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So that was the macula densa cells of the distal convoluted tubule with the juxtaglomerular cells of the vessels. And the macula densa cells, we said, monitored the filtrate. So it monitors the filtrate for sodium. So when sodium is high in the filtrate, that means it's leaving the blood. So that means blood volume is going down because water's going to follow it. Okay, so blood volume is decreasing, so blood pressure is decreasing. So this means we've got low blood pressure. So when we have that, the macula densa cells signal the juxtaglomerular cells in those vessels to secrete renin. Renin comes into contact with a plasma protein called angiotensinogen. And when it contacts that plasma protein, angiotensinogen becomes activated into angiotensin 1. If angiotensin 1 comes into contact with an enzyme called ACE, it will become angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2, as we talked about, causes vasoconstriction. It increases the thirst, and it increases cardiac output. Okay, so we know all that. That's just review. Well, another thing that angiotensin 2 does is it increases aldosterone production. So angiotensin 2 increases or stimulates aldosterone production. Okay, so once we have aldosterone, so what does aldosterone do? Well, when you think about aldosterone, you think about sodium because it deals with sodium. So in the kidney, in the tubules, and this is at the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So we have these cells. This is our tubule. So here are the cells of our tubule. We've got little cuboidal cells here. And over here's the lumen. Okay, so this is filtrate. And then over on the other basolateral side is blood vessels. Okay, so these cells that are in the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule are special. They're called principal cells. And principal cells are special because they are sensitive to aldosterone. So that's what this is a principal cell. So how do we get aldosterone? Well, aldosterone is a hormone, right? So it's going to come to us in the blood. So aldosterone comes in the blood. Here's our little aldosterone things. And how's it going to get to the cell? What's it going to do with the cell? This is a steroid hormone, so its receptor, of course, is going to be inside the cell. So when it comes through, it's going to diffuse through the membrane and bind to the receptor inside the cell. And this is a peptide hormone, a steroid hormone. It's a steroid hormone, so of course its function is protein synthesis. Okay, so it's going to stimulate this cell, this principal cell, to make proteins. And what it's going to do is it's going to make little channels that are specific to sodium. And the sodium that's in the filtrate is going to go into the cell. So it's going to go into the cell, and we need it to keep coming into the cell. So again, we've got the same thing going on in this type of cell as we would any other cell we've talked about that does these kind of things. So we have the sodium-potassium pump. So the sodium-potassium pump pumps the sodium out, which goes into the blood. And of course, it's going to bring in potassium. Okay, so now we have sodium going out. We've got potassium coming into the cell. Well, guess what the cell also makes? It also makes channels for potassium. So now potassium is going to leave the cell and go into the filtrate. Okay, so when aldosterone is there, so in the presence of aldosterone, potassium is secreted. So we lose potassium to reabsorb and retain sodium. But as we retain sodium, water follows and blood volume goes up. Aldosterone almost always works with ADH. Okay, so when ADH is active, aldosterone is usually active as well. Okay, so that is the complete story of aldosterone, and that is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So we started that with the GFR and ended it with blood pressure and blood volume, which of course has to do with the condition of the extracellular fluid. So you'll see that in both chapter 25 and in chapter 26 with fluid balance.